It wasn't a polite chuckle or a restrained director's acknowledgement from behind a monitor. It was full-bodied, sudden, and contagious, the kind of laugh that made everyone on set feel as if they were in on a wonderful secret. Years later, when Elwes is asked about The Princess Bride, that laugh is often the first thing that comes to mind. Even before the sword fights, the cliffs of insanity were the immortal lines that generations now quote by heart. Rob made you feel safe, Elwes once said. Safe enough to be silly, safe enough to fail, safe enough to be sincere. It was the mid-1980s when Elwes first met Reiner, a director already beloved for his Spinal Tap and Stand By Me, yet still preparing to take a creative leap with a fairy tale that didn't quite fit into any known box. The Princess Bride was whimsical but sharp, romantic but ironic, classic yet self-aware. Studios didn't know what to do with it. Audiences didn't know they needed it. Rob Reiner, however, knew exactly what kind of movie he wanted to make. For Cary Elwes, that a young actor still carving out his place in Hollywood, being cast as Wesley was both a dream and a mystery. I didn't fully understand the tone at first, he later admitted. Was it parody? Was it sincere romance? Was it adventure? The answer, as Reiner explained during their earliest conversations, was simple and impossible at the same time. All of it. Reiner's direction wasn't about rigid control. Instead, it was about trust. Elwes recalls that Rob would often give notes, not as instructions, but as invitations. What if you tried it this way? What happens if you lean into the romance just a bit more? Don't play the joke, play the truth. That philosophy shaped what would become one of Elwes' favorite memories from the entire production. It happened during the filming of the now iconic duel between Wesley and Inigo Montoya, played by Mandy Patinkin. The scene was already ambitious. Two skilled swordsmen, elaborate choreography, a cliffside setting, and dialogue that danced between humor and genuine respect. Reiner knew the scene was crucial. It needed to be thrilling, funny, and emotionally grounded all at once. On the day of filming, the cast and crew were tense. The choreography was complex, the schedule tight. Elwes remembers nailing take after take, sweat pouring under his costume, muscles aching. Then, somewhere between exhaustion and adrenaline, something magical happened. The rhythm clicked, the lines flowed. The swordplay became less like choreography and more like conversation. When the final take ended, there was a moment of silence. Then Rob Reiner burst out laughing and clapping, stepping out from behind the camera with pure delight on his face. "That's it," he shouted. "That's the movie." For Elwes, that moment crystallized everything Reiner brought to the set. He wasn't just a director chasing coverage or ticking off shots on a list. He was an audience of one. An audience who loved stories, who loved actors, who loved the sheer joy of filmmaking. When Rob laughed, it wasn't performative, it was instinctive. And when he was moved, you felt it immediately. Another favorite memory came not from a big action sequence, but from something quieter. There was a scene early in the film where Wesley, disguised as the dread pirate Roberts, says goodbye to Buttercup. The moment is simple, intimate, and emotionally exposed. Elwes recalls feeling unsure. Was he pushing too hard? Was he underplaying it? Reiner noticed the hesitation. Instead of giving technical direction, Rob pulled Elwes aside and told him a story, one about childhood, about fairy tales read aloud, about the feeling of believing completely in a story even while knowing it wasn't real. "Play it as if this is the last story anyone will ever tell," Reiner said softly. Elwes carried that note into the scene, and it stayed with him long after filming wrapped. That was Rob's gift, he later reflected. He didn't direct performances, he directed hearts. Off-set, Reiner fostered an atmosphere that felt more like a family than a film production. Lunch breaks were filled with laughter. Cast members felt encouraged to bring ideas, jokes, and even doubts. No one was dismissed. No one was made to feel small. For a movie that balanced irony and earnestness so delicately, that environment was essential. Elwes also remembers how fiercely Reiner protected the film's tone during post-production. There were pressures to lean harder into parody, to make it broader, sillier. Rob resisted. He insisted that the romance be real, that the stakes matter, that the audience be allowed to feel something genuine beneath the jokes. He believed in the intelligence of the audience, Elwes said, and he believed that sincerity was not the enemy of humor. Time, of course, proved him right. When The Princess Bride was released, it didn't explode at the box office, but it lingered. It found its audience slowly through home video, television reruns, and word of mouth. It became a rite of passage, a shared language, a film quoted between parents and children, friends and lovers. As the years passed, Elwes watched the film transform from a modest success into a cultural touchstone. And through every reunion, every anniversary screening, every fan encounter, one thing remained constant. Rob Reiner's presence loomed large. At conventions, fans would ask Elwes about famous lines, favorite scenes, behind-the-scenes mishaps, and inevitably, the conversation would return to Rob, his patience, his humor, his unwavering belief in the story. One fan once asked Elwes what he thought was the secret to the film's enduring popularity. Elwes didn't hesitate. Rob treated it like it mattered, he said. He never winked at the camera. He never apologized for the romance. He made a fairy tale with absolute conviction. Today, when Elwes looks back on his career, spanning genres, decades, and continents, The Princess Bride still holds a singular place. Not just because of its success or its fans, but because of the way it was made. His favorite memory of Rob Reiner isn't a single joke or shot or line of dialogue. It's the feeling of standing on that set, sword in hand, knowing that the man behind the camera believed completely in the world they were creating. That kind of belief changes you, Elwes says. It stays with you. And perhaps that's why The Princess Bride still feels alive all these years later, because it was made not with cynicism or calculation, but with joy, trust, and a director whose laughter reminded everyone that stories, especially fairy tales, are worth believing in. As Rob Reiner's laugh echoes through Elwes' memories, it becomes clear that the greatest magic of The Princess Bride wasn't just captured on film. It lived in the spaces between takes, in quiet conversations, and in the unwavering conviction of a director who knew that true love, after all, is never a joke. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the costumes were packed away, that conviction continued to ripple through Cary Elwes' life in quiet, unexpected ways. Years later, at a screening crowded with fans who mouthed every line in unison, Elwes sat in the back row and watched the film as if seeing it anew. He wasn't watching himself anymore. He was watching the audience. Children laughing at Miracle Max, adults wiping tears during Wesley's devotion, couples exchanging knowing smiles. And once again, he heard Rob Reiner's laugh in his head, that unmistakable sound of delight when something worked exactly as it should. After the credits rolled, Elwes stepped outside into the cool night air, surrounded by people quoting dialogue with reverence usually reserved for poetry. Someone shouted, "As you wish." Another raised a fist and declared, "Inconceivable." The words had become timeless, but what struck Elwes most was how kind the crowd felt, how joyful, how connected. That, he realized, was another of Rob's invisible fingerprints on the film. Rob believed that humor should never humiliate. Elwes reflected later, "No one is mocked in The Princess Bride. Even the villains are loved. That's rare." He recalled moments on set when Reiner would gently steer scenes away from cruelty, even accidental cruelty. If a joke landed at the expense of a character's dignity, Rob would quietly suggest another approach. "Let's laugh with them," he'd say, "not at them." It was a small distinction, but it shaped the soul of the movie. As the decades passed, Elwes found himself becoming, in small ways, a messenger for Reiner's philosophy. On other sets, when tension rose or self-doubt crept in, Elwes remembered how Rob created space for creativity instead of fear. He remembered being trusted. He remembered being listened to, and he tried to pass that on. There was one particularly poignant moment many years later, when Elwes and Reiner reunited at a retrospective honoring Rob's career. As clips from The Princess Bride played on a massive screen, Elwes noticed Rob watching not himself, but the audience. He was smiling, not with pride, but with gratitude. Afterward, Elwes approached him and said, "You know, Rob, people still tell me this film helped them through hard times." Reiner paused, visibly moved. "That's all I ever wanted," he replied, "to make something that felt like a friend." For Elwes, that exchange became his new favorite memory. Because in that moment, it was clear that The Princess Bride wasn't just a film about true love and adventure. It was a reflection of the man who guided it, someone who believed that stories could be playful without being hollow, heartfelt without being naive, and funny without losing their humanity. And so, whenever Cary Elwes is asked again about Rob Reiner, about his favorite memory, his lasting impression, he smiles. He doesn't talk first about the swords or the lines or the fame. He talks about belief, belief in stories, belief in people, belief that joy, when treated seriously, can become immortal. And somewhere in that memory, just behind the words, Rob Reiner is still laughing, reminding everyone on set and everyone watching that fairy tales endure when they are told with love. That laughter, Elwes believes, is the true legacy of The Princess Bride, a sound that lingers far beyond the screen, carried in the memories of everyone who was lucky enough to be part of it. As the years moved on, Elwes began to notice something quietly remarkable. No matter where he traveled, airports, bookstores, film sets on the other side of the world, someone would eventually approach him with a smile that carried recognition deeper than celebrity. They didn't speak first of fame or awards. They spoke of comfort, of childhood, of nights when the world felt uncertain and a familiar story made it manageable again. And almost always, Rob Reiner's name came up. He made it gentle. One fan once told Elwes, "That movie feels like being taken care of." That comment stayed with him. Elwes realized that Reiner had done something deceptively difficult. He had directed with empathy. Every choice, from pacing to performance to silence, was guided by an understanding of how it would feel to watch the story unfold. The humor was never sharp enough to wound, the romance never ironic enough to undermine itself. In a time when cynicism was becoming fashionable, Rob chose sincerity and trusted it to hold. Behind the scenes, that same empathy defined his leadership. Elwes remembered days when minor frustrations threatened to derail the mood. Technical delays, weather problems, fatigue. Reiner never raised his voice. Instead, he gathered people together, cracked a joke, reminded everyone why they were there. "We're making a fairy tale," he'd say. "Let's not forget to enjoy it." That sense of perspective shaped Elwes profoundly. Years later, when he found himself mentoring younger actors, he borrowed Rob's approach, offering reassurance instead of pressure, curiosity instead of command. In interviews, Elwes has admitted that much of what he learned about professionalism came not from acting classes, but from watching Rob Reiner treat people with respect. One of Elwes' most cherished later memories involved a letter he received from a fan, someone who had grown up watching The Princess Bride during a prolonged illness. The fan wrote about how the film had been a constant companion, something that never talked down to them or demanded anything in return. Elwes read the letter, then immediately thought of Rob. He shared it with Reiner, who read it quietly and handed it back without a word. His eyes were wet. "That's why we do this," Rob finally said. In that simple sentence, Elwes heard the same voice that had guided him decades earlier on set, steady, thoughtful, anchored in purpose. Fame had never been the point. Longevity had never been the goal. Connection was. At anniversary screenings, Elwes now often pauses before answering questions. He looks out at the audience, some discovering the film for the first time, others returning for the 100th, and he imagines Rob standing just off to the side, arms folded, eyes sparkling, waiting to see if the moment lands. And it always does. Because The Princess Bride endures not merely as a beloved film, but as a shared emotional language passed from one generation to the next. Parents introduce it to children. Friends quote it during difficult times. Lovers borrow its lines as shorthand for devotion. For Cary Elwes, every one of those moments is an echo of Rob Reiner's original faith in the story. A faith that joy could be intelligent, that romance could be brave, that laughter could be generous. And so the story continues, not just on screens, but in living rooms, classrooms, hospital rooms, and quiet evenings when someone presses play and steps back into a world that feels safe and hopeful. A world shaped by a director who believed that fairy tales matter, and an actor who will forever carry that belief with him, grateful for a favorite memory that never fades. That gratitude, Elwes has come to understand, is inseparable from responsibility. As time went on, he noticed how carefully fans handled the film in conversation, almost as if it were something fragile and sacred. They didn't treat it like nostalgia alone. They treated it like a promise that stories could still be earnest, that goodness could exist without embarrassment. Elwes began to feel like a steward of that promise, and once again, he traced the feeling back to Rob Reiner. Rob never spoke about legacy while they were making the film. He spoke about moments, about whether a scene felt right, about whether a character's heart was visible. If the heart is clear, Rob would say, everything else forgives itself. Elwes didn't fully grasp the weight of that idea at the time. Only years later did it reveal its truth. In an industry that constantly reinvents itself, The Princess Bride never needed reinvention. It remained intact because it was built on something timeless. Elwes believes that was no accident. Reiner had shielded the film from trend chasing, from irony as armor, from the temptation to explain the joke too loudly. He trusted silence. He trusted simplicity. There was one final memory Elwes often returns to, a quiet one, far from cameras and applause. Near the end of production, as the days shortened and the work wound down, Rob stood watching the set being dismantled. No speech, no sentimentality, just a thoughtful stillness. Elwes approached him and thanked him for the role, for the trust, for the experience. Rob smiled and said, almost absent-mindedly, I think people are going to hold on to this one. It wasn't confidence, it was hope. Decades later, Elwes knows how right that hope was. He sees it every time a young fan discovers the film for the first time and laughs in exactly the same places. Every time someone quotes a line not to be clever, but to be kind. Every time the story offers comfort without asking for anything in return. For Elwes, expanding that story now means carrying it forward. Speaking of Rob Reiner, not just as a director, but as a reminder of how stories should be told, with care, with courage, with joy that doesn't diminish itself. And so, the memory continues to grow, not fading with time, but deepening like a well-loved book whose pages soften with every reading. A favorite memory, yes, but also a living one. That living memory now feels less like a single chapter and more like a thread woven through Cary Elwes' life. With each passing year, he understands more clearly that what Rob Reiner gave him wasn't just a defining role. It was a way of seeing storytelling as an act of generosity, the kind that reaches forward in time, offering itself to people you will never meet. Elwes has watched new generations discover The Princess Bride in a world far more complicated than the one in which it was made. And yet the film still works. It still reassures. It still reminds viewers that love can be steadfast, courage can be playful, and hope doesn't have to shout to be strong. When Elwes speaks now, he speaks softly about Rob, almost reverently. Not because Reiner demands reverence, but because his influence was quiet and enduring. He taught by example that joy is a discipline, that kindness is a creative choice, and that sincerity, when protected, can outlast any trend. And so, whenever Elwes is asked again to share his favorite memory of Rob Reiner, he realizes the answer keeps expanding. It's in every laugh that sounds a little like Rob's, every moment an audience leans forward together, every time someone says, as you wish, and means I see you. The story never really ends. It simply keeps being told, exactly the way Rob Reiner always believed it should be.